Right, welcome to first session, Peace Building and Reconciliation in a Unified Korea, with a question mark at the end. This is the first panel session of the two-day conference, so what we're going to do is raise a lot of issues and questions, and they will be answered by the panelists in the next session. How about that? Yes. I'm Youngshik Bong, research fellow at the Asan Institute. It is so nice to see old friends and students from the American University, and I'm so happy to come back to DC and enjoy what the city offers, including Five Guys and Potbelly. I miss them a lot. So on peace building and reconciliation in a unified Korea, each panelist will speak about 10 to 15 minutes, and we will open up for question and answer. Let me very briefly introduce the speakers. On my immediate left, we have Professor David Cohen at the University of, Andrew Natsios, a professor at Texas A&M University. Professor Natsios at the George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institution. Natsios served as an administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development from 2002 to January 2006. He also wrote many influential books, including U.S. Foreign Policy and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse in 1997, and the Great North Korean Famine, and the Sudan, South Sudan, and Darfur. And we also have Professor David Cohen at University of California, Berkeley, as the anchor distinguished professor for the humanities and the founding director of the Berkeley War Crimes Studies Center. He's now professor in the graduate school at UC Berkeley and professor of law at the William S. Richardson School of Law, University of Hawaii. And we have Lavinia Stan. Professor Stan is an associate professor of political science at St. Francis Xavier University in Canada, and past member of the Scientific Council of the Institute for the Investigation of Communist Crimes, a transitional justice institution in Bucharest, Romania. She has published a number of influential books by Cambridge University Press and other press as well. We are going to proceed in order that's listed in the program. That is, Professor Natsios will be the first speaker.
Thank you very much. I speak as a practitioner who writes rather than a scholar who practices. So my experience in the since 1989 has been actually managing responses to complex humanitarian emergencies, to responses to failed states, to wars, to civil conflicts. I was in the Rwandan, I was in the NGO community when the Rwandan genocide took place, and was there just a couple of months after the first phase ended. So my own personal experience has affected in a profound way my own view of this. I am always entertained when I go to these conferences when we speak in very abstract terms of what everyone ought to do when they're in the middle of, well, I've been in the middle of these, and doing many of the things people say we ought to do is sometimes, I think, is preposterous. It has nothing to do with reality, because the options open to people who are practitioners in the field, whether they're UN peacekeeping forces or American troops or NGO workers or diplomats from whatever country or aid workers, to actually change things on the ground is much more limited, much more constrained than we like to think. And the problem is we worry about the unintended consequences of what we do. As I look back on the 25 years I've been involved in this, I did things that I did not intend to have bad consequences. They were very well intended, but they had effects that were not what we expected, not what we expected. Let me just start off the conversation with North Korea saying that I studied North Korea for some years from the humanitarian, food security, and famine perspective, more at the grassroots level, but I've observed North Korea since I was Vice President of World Vision in the mid-1990s during the famine. And one of the things that I find astonishing is the assumption in the United States, and I think in South Korea, is that if there is a transition in North Korea, it's going to be toward unification with South Korea or toward a democracy. And I personally think that's the most naive assumption I could possibly imagine. It is much more likely it will be a transition into some puppet state of China. It is not now in that category quite yet, but it has become an economic appendage of China. Just in the last 3 years, there's been a profound change where the North Korean economy has been basically taken over by China. And we've missed this in the West. I think some South Korean people in the business community are aware of this, and South Korean diplomats, and maybe the South Korean intelligence service, but it is not widely understood that in many ways the Chinese are already in charge, but not politically yet. Just in an economic sense, the next step could be, if the regime destabilizes, for them. I don't think they'd invade. I think the Chinese are much more subtle than that. But they do not want American and South Korean troops on the Tumen River facing them 10 miles away. They want a buffer, and the buffer is North Korea. And so the likelihood, in my view, is that we may see a transition to a regime that is, in fact, more tightly controlled by the Chinese, in which case the issue of transitional justice, as we and the international community and among democracies define it, is not going to quite turn out the way we expect. Transitional justice operates when a democracy takes over or a country that is evolving toward a democracy. That could well not be the case. The second situational circumstance that would affect transitional justice is if there is prolonged civil war in the North among factions. I just say the Chinese nor the South Koreans or Americans intervene, and factions either based on region or, in Romania we had a civil war basically between the intelligence service and the military. The military had a coup against the Securitate, the intelligence service that was supporting Ceausescu, and the security forces lost and the military won. It was basically a coup. We think it was a revolution. It was not a revolution. It was one service versus another. That could happen in North Korea very easily. There's a lot of resentment between different parts of the North Korean regime because the intelligence service gets more benefits than most of the military does. If that happens, we could have a problem, serious problem, with retributive violence. And I'll go into that in a minute because I saw this happen in a number of places around the world. We're seeing it unfold now in Syria on a massive scale. And the longer a transition takes place, where there is no central government, to use the traditional definition, with a monopoly in the use of force, you will see people taking justice into their own hands, and you will see what I would call a devolution of barbarism, of people killing each other in retaliation for their relatives being killed. People here don't have quite the same experience. If your wife and your children were murdered in front of you, your life is over. You will never forget that. It'll be in your dreams every night. And people, I'm always astonished by people who say, well, people can forget about it. They don't forget about it, ever, ever. And if there is some sort of transitional justice system in place, then the people who are obsessed with revenge think they have no other alternative. They will take justice into their own hands, and you will simply have this evolving pattern of retributive violence that causes chaos in the society, and where it's very hard to stitch the society back together again. The third option, which would be the most desirable from a South Korean or American perspective, or maybe I would like to think in an international perspective, would be a transition to a democratic system, perhaps in unison with the South Korean government, that's nonviolent, that's consensual somehow. I have to say that the chances of that happening are somewhat remote, but you never know. I mean, things do happen. It happened in South Africa, for example. I never thought South Africa would evolve as it has. You could also, there are many other options, but the first thing I want to say is our planning and our view of transitional justice has to be influenced by the way in which the transition takes place. Is it dominated by the Chinese? Is it chaos for an extended period of time? Or is it dominated by the United States and South Korea, or just the South Koreans? Let me go back to the issue of retributive violence. I was the executive officer of the Kuwaiti Task Force, a task force very few Americans have ever heard of. It was put together in the first Gulf War in 1991. I was working at USAID as the director of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and my reserve unit was mobilized. It was a civil affairs unit, and our job was to plan the reconstruction of Kuwait. This was in the first war, not the second war, with the Kuwaiti emir's cabinet in exile in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And we worked with them, and we actually were in their offices when the liberation took place of Kuwait from the Iraqis, and we worked with them. And what we had planned for, because some of the staff had been through this several times at aid, said, it's not going to be the economy or infrastructure, it's going to be retaliation against the Palestinians. And we said, what are you talking about? They said there are 500,000 Palestinians, the PLO endorsed the invasion, and Saddam Hussein promised that Kuwait would be the new Palestinian state, publicly. And he said, we will turn Kuwait over to you. The 500,000 Palestinians living in Kuwait were seen as loyal Kuwaiti citizens before Saddam invaded, and were the best treated of any Palestinian community anywhere in the world, in the Middle East, I should say. That is to say, the Arab world does not treat Palestinians very well. People think it's just the Israelis. It's not just the Israelis. They're not treated very well in any Arab country, except for Kuwait. And so the Kuwaitis felt particularly betrayed, and they began, as soon as liberation took place, right in the first few days, they began executing the Palestinians, anyone that they assumed had been involved in treasonous behavior, who supported the Iraqis, who were spying for the Iraqis, or were helping destroy Kuwaiti infrastructure. And so the underground in Kuwait systematically began taking people out and shooting them. We put a stop to it, but with great difficulty. And so I remember those circumstances very well. And the one thing that diffused all the pressure that was going on, was when we announced there would be war crimes trials against anyone, no matter who they were collaborating with the Iraqis to turn Kuwaitis in or to execute people during the occupation. That diffused a lot of tension, and those trials did take place, as a matter of fact. The final issue I wanted to deal with just briefly are the prison camps. I am co-chairman of the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea, and our executive director, Greg Scarlett, is going to speak in the next session. But we have done our own report that we published last year. It was the second time we published it in a revised form by David Hawk, of the prison camps. And we do have a very famous figure in the back row who I'm going to be interviewing later today, Mr. Shin, who is become a famous world figure on this because he is the only person born in the camps to have escaped. Now, it is not, his book is making this famous, but there is enormous evidence of widespread systematic atrocities, not for the last few years, for 50 years, since the camps were formed in the late 1950s. And there are many reports out now in South Korea of these, I have to say, they are atrocities. The systematic and brutal treatment of prisoners who are in there for no reason other than their ancestor may have been guilty of being on the wrong side of the Korean War, or who had defaced a picture of Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un or Kim Il-sung. I mean, the crimes are bizarre by our standards. Those camps will be a focus of transitional justice. And the more information we have, the more evidence we have, the more that we can treat these in a reasonable way in any transition. I think that there are other issues certainly in North Korea, but that has to be at the center of it. And what happens to the people in the 150,000 to 200,000 people still in those camps in any transition they could be at risk. In fact, I think they will be at risk. And what we do, not after everything's stable, but in the interim period, to protect those people is, in my view, one of the issues that we must focus on now and plan for so we do not have even worse atrocities take place. Last comment about Mr. Shin's book. He says in it he never knew what his teachers' names were. It's interesting. The North Koreans, teachers don't tell students in the prison camps what their teachers' names are. Why is that? It's because they know what they're doing is terrible, is evil, and that it could result in prosecution later on. That's why the names aren't known, because they're embarrassed. They're afraid of what they're doing will be found out. And that means the people in the camps who do know what atrocities have been committed are going to be at risk. Anybody who's seen a crime, anybody who could be a witness at a trial, could be at risk in the event of a collapse of the regime. Thank you very much.
Right. Our next speaker is Professor David Cohen.
Thank you very much. I should begin by saying that I am not a Korean expert, even remotely. My own work in transitional justice has been an involvement in places like Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, East Timor with the UN accountability process there, and with the Bilateral Truth Commission in Sierra Leone, in Indonesia, and other places. And so what I would like to do is reflect a little bit on that experience about some of the possibilities for transitional justice in a unified Korea. And I'd like to echo the sentiment that was just expressed before me, which is transitional justice is a practical matter, not a theoretical one. And whatever the hopes and ambitions and aspirations may be of its practitioners, the realities are conditioned by the political exigencies of the particular situation, and are often much more limited than we would hope. And the attempt in places like Timor and Cambodia to pursue a very ambitious and idealistic program often leads both to the failure of that program and to the greatly disappointed expectations of a public which has been led to believe that justice will deliver things that it can never deliver in those contexts. If we look back on this period that Professor Teitel indicated of sort of transitional justice, but reaching back to the Reconstruction, not called transitional justice programs then, but they were, the Reconstruction programs of the Allies in post-war Germany and Japan, to today, we can see a very broad range of theoretical possibilities. But as I just said, it's not theoretical possibilities that matter, it's the realities of particular contexts. One thing that a review of that history reveals is that transition and transitional justice is not a process that happens in a moment of transition. It's something that plays itself out over decades. And certainly my own work in Indonesia over the past 12 years has led me to understand that the accomplishment of a real transition to democracy and accountability and so forth will be something that's a matter of generational change in Indonesia. A lot has been done, but a lot remains to be done. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Measures that may have been impossible in the immediate aftermath of political transition, for example, trials, may become possible later, as we heard about Chile and Argentina, as is going on in Guatemala today, and is going on now some 30 years after the fall of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. They, of course, bring their own problems. That is, justice that comes very late can be complicated and difficult in some ways. Another lesson, I think, of previous transitions is that however much we might want this to be the case, there's no such thing as what we might call a clean slate solution. We're just going to start over. We're going to build new institutions. The past is the past, and we can look to the future. Transitional justice is always messy. It's incomplete. It's wrought with tensions between competing goals and unintended consequences, and the legacy of the past looms over ongoing transitional justice measures, because the individuals who inhabit the institutions that are necessarily still in place are individuals whose experience was conditioned by previous regimes, and we can't simply make all of those individuals disappear. Again, this is not necessarily a bad thing, and it raises the issue of unintended consequences that we've heard about. If we look at the German denazification, Allied denazification program in occupied Germany in post-1945, we saw an incredibly ambitious program that initially involved 14 million Germans filling out questionnaires about their activities during the Third Reich. It led to then quasi-judicial proceedings against more than 2 million of these individuals before denazification boards. The result of that was not exactly what was intended. Rather than eliminating those individuals from the future of West Germany, the denazification boards provided a mechanism for reintegrating them and for allowing them to reinvent themselves as supporters and citizens of a new democratic Germany. The certificates that were issued by the denazification boards were called Persilscheine. That is, Persil is one of the most popular laundry detergents in Germany, and that was the way that you washed yourself clean so that you could become a civil servant or a businessman or whatever in the new Germany, conveniently forgetting your past. But the past lived on, and it's estimated that under the Adenauer regime, about half of the members of the German parliament and about 70% of German civil servants and judges had served the previous regime, which was convenient to forget. So we don't start over from a clean slate. And this is my own personal experience in Indonesia, where despite the last 15 years of reformasi, of the reform movement that has made Indonesia one of the most democratic states in Southeast Asia, the individuals that we deal with in the Attorney General's office, in the police, and so forth, were all educated and socialized by the previous regime. They received their legal education under the Suharto regime. They received their professionalization under the Suharto regime, and those habits of mind die hard. If we look at these past decades of transitional justice, we see a very wide variety of different kinds of mechanisms that have been used and are, in theory, available. There are a wide range of formal accountability mechanisms, from the Gacaca courts and community reconciliation processes in East Timor and Rwanda to the elevated international tribunals like the ICC, the ICTY, and many variations in between of national and internationalized tribunals. There's a wide variety of truth-seeking mechanisms, which in some cases have been linked to accountability processes and in other cases operated independently. We've seen situations where there's been a more or less complete dismantling of previous institutional structures, and others where institutional structures have remained intact. We've seen cleansing mechanisms or lustration, as in the case of post-war Germany, which I've mentioned, post-war Japan, not exactly successful. We've seen a wide variety of reintegration and socialization measures, including complete revamping of university systems, of schools, of public education, and so on and so forth, all of which are important dimensions of a lasting transition. Reparative measures, we've heard about the increasing importance of the victim perspective in transitional justice. This has been a major development, but in many ways not a very successful or happy one. And then finally, I would say the more ephemeral dimension of what I would call who writes the history. How is the collective memory and the historical narrative of what has happened in previous decades constructed? Who owns it and who uses it for what purposes? These are all issues that arise. We've seen in every transitional situation from occupied post-war France to Germany to Japan or whatever, the way that histories are invented and constructed to suit the politics of the present. So there's a variety of, a huge variety of experience available for a future unified Korea. But the one thing that I think is certain is that there are no formulas for success. Transitional justice scholars have at sometimes written quite a lot about different models of tribunals, different models of combinations of institutions. And what I would argue, and I think I'm echoing your sentiment here, is that there are no fixed models that promise general solutions. There are context-specific solutions that must arise out of very realistic appraisals of the actual possibilities of a given situation. And those actual possibilities may be very different than the hopes and aspirations and ideals that transitional justice practitioners, victims, and others may bring to a transitional situation. If we look, for example, again at the post-war period in occupied Japan, we had an international tribunal operating, and we had hundreds of other war crimes trials taking place to bring Japanese perpetrators of war crimes to justice. In regard to the Tokyo Tribunal, the Asian counterpart to Nuremberg, I would argue that its greatest failing as a tribunal was a failure to bring Emperor Hirohito before the court and to prosecute him for his leading role in the war. Why did this not happen? It didn't happen because the British and American governments decided that Hirohito would be what they called, quote, a useful tool, unquote, for the democratization program that they hoped to initiate in Japan. And for that reason, over the vehement protests of the Australian government and other governments, they did not bring him to trial. Instead, he was trotted out to the Japanese public on carefully managed occasions by the occupying powers to promote democracy in the new Japan. In the case of transitional justice in an transitional justice in a unified Korea, as we have heard already, I think that everything will depend on how the transition comes about. Will it follow an armed conflict? Will it be the result of internal collapse, a military coup, or civil war? Will it come through the impact of economic necessity and regional political dynamics? Different paths to transition will create different limits and different possibilities for transitional justice. Will there be a negotiated transition, or will it be a situation of unconditional surrender following some sort of extreme violence that characterized the Allied reckoning with post-war Germany and post-war Japan? If so, will all North Korean institutions be dismantled, their officials fired, subjected to justice or lustration processes? If they are, how will successor institutions function? How will the North Korean public react to the fall of their regime, and what factors will influence the nature of that reaction? How divided will that North Korean public be in their attitudes towards the past and the future? Populations in transitional situations are not unified. The successor regime likes to think they are. We have to remember that in East Timor, in the UN referendum that brought about independence, 30% of the Timorese voted against independence and for remaining with Indonesia. In the northern city of Pai Lin, a Khmer Rouge stronghold during the Civil War in Cambodia, in 2008, just 5 years ago, when the tribunal was in full swing, there was a ceremony commemorating the death of Pol Pot, and people prayed for the return of Brother Number One to save Cambodia. The Cambodian public also does not have one view. As in any country, there is no one view. How will a new government cope with the inevitable disaffection that will follow the realization of how long the road ahead will be? Initial moments of transition seem to hold great promise, and as we've seen in East Germany, the former East Germany, and in many other places, that road can be much longer, much more difficult, and involve much more suffering than was anticipated, and can produce resentment, disappointment, and many unforeseen consequences. So to move to a conclusion, as I think I'm supposed to do, in such a situation, it would be idle to say that option X, option Y, or the combination of X and Y represent the best model for transitional justice in a unified Korea. I, at least, I'm not a Korean expert, lack the ability to see so far into the future to see what would be required in such a situation. What I think we can do is look at the various factors and parameters that need to be taken into account by decision makers and that shape the possibilities for achieving whatever measure of justice, truth, and reconciliation is possible in a concrete situation. And I would just like to conclude by quickly going through what are some of those challenges. The first is a challenge of time, of historical depth, of crimes reaching back decades, and how to come to terms with those. Time affects transitional processes in other ways. Justice can be too slow. In some cases, it can be too fast, like the 15-minute trials conducted by the Soviet occupying power in the eastern part of the Soviet occupation zone in Germany. I've already talked about the way in which the remaining influences of the previous regime impact current situations, of the way that expectations must be managed, of the balance between justice, revenge, and reconciliation that informs every transitional situation, and above all, the way in which the different perspectives of victims, real victims and would-be victims, victims sometimes reinvent themselves as victims when they've been perpetrators or bystanders, the varying perspectives of victims, collaborators, bystanders, perpetrators, and the indifferent inform the transitional process. There's a question of justice for perpetrators. That's easy to say. Who? How many? How wide the net? We're talking about situations in which there may be hundreds of thousands of potential perpetrators. The Rwandan government had a solution to that in its gacaca process, but I would be loath to call that a justice process. It's a community process or a governmental process of coming to terms with the past that has little to do with what we would recognize as justice. There are trials of many varieties. There are truth commissions, there are investigation commissions, there's shaming, there's punishment, but again, who, how many, what outcomes, and so on and so forth. What will happen to institutions, governmental entities, universities? This was a question of universities, was one that confronted Germany after reunification. What do you do with law faculties in a country where the law has ceased to exist? On the day of reunification, East German law ceased to exist, and the subject matter that was the provenance of every law professor and every lawyer in the country was no longer there. What do you do about that? And who takes over that function? And then you can extrapolate to other institutions. What do you do about victims and survivors, about reparations and reconciliation? How widely conceived? Is everyone a victim of a repressive regime, or only those who are in a gulag or the victims of torture? Are bystanders also victims? Are collaborators victims? It has been alleged in many situations that they too are victims of repression. At the societal level, we have processes of education, history and truth, documentation and preservation, memorialization, reintegration, and so forth. All of these are the challenges or the parameters that must be taken into account. But again, I would emphasize and join my colleague in saying which of those are available in what form and to what extent will be a matter that is difficult or impossible for us to foresee, for it will depend upon the circumstances under which a transition takes place. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Professor Stein?
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Lisa and the organizers for putting together this wonderful conference, and certainly I'm sure that I will learn a lot about Korea these days. In the Encyclopedia of Transitional Justice that I co-edited, and it was published in January this year, we included several entries on South Korea, and I am hopeful that by the time we are getting out the second edition of the encyclopedia, we would have also entries on North Korea or reunited Korea. I chose to answer one of the questions assigned for this panel. Should a reunited Korea confront the legacies of human rights abuses and atrocities in North Korea? And if so, how exactly? My perspective is that of a comparative politics person, very much geared on policy in a way. The short answer would be yes, they should, and by adopting a multiplicity of methods, we could break for coffee, you know, but I would need 15 minutes to make a point. So, should a reunited Korea confront the legacies of the communist North Korea? I think if we want to answer this question, we need to look around the world to the experience of other countries, and the experience of transitional justice in various regions is very diverse. Yeah, we have the Spanish example of forgive and forget, but we also have other examples of Germany, countries that did a lot of reckoning with the past. I think that rather than looking at a number of regions coming from Eastern Europe, I would argue that it is most useful to look at countries with a kind of political experience that is very similar to what happens today in North Korea. And that happens to be the region that I know best, Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And again, if we look at the experience of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, in terms of their choice of effecting transitional justice, I think there are very clear patterns that one could see. For example, in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, they had effected more transitional justice in the form of inquiry commissions, in the form of court trials of former KGB members, in the form of lustration, through lustration laws and also citizenship laws. And their democracy is more stable. It was attained earlier than the rest of the Soviet Union, where you had very little democracy and very little transitional justice. In Russia, for example, not only that the former KGB legacy was not, investigated seriously at any point in time, but recently, 2 years or 3 years ago, Russia even adopted a law prosecuting people who are falsifying history by declaring the Soviet regime as a criminal, repressive regime. So different patterns within Eastern Europe, within the former Soviet bloc, tend to correlate transitional justice with democratization. The more transitional justice you get, at the same time, you will have more democratization. As a comparative politics person, I would say that democratization is the most important dimension or criteria that we are looking for when we are looking at transitions. Yeah. I can go on and on with examples from the former communist bloc, but I'll leave them aside just for discussion or just because there are too many of them, and trust me, the patterns are there. The more democratization you have, the more transitional justice, the less democratization you have, the weaker or more cosmetic or, makeup transitional justice you have. Well, when I started to think about these answers, I took it in a way for granted that the two assumptions built in the question will be there. The fact that North Korea will get rid of its communist regime. I don't know if it will become a democracy, and the fact that there will be a reunification of the two Koreas. So when I thought of how exactly the reunited Korea will tackle this transitional justice process, it seems to me that two main dimensions should be taken into account. So starting from the premise that they want to move ahead, and which is a big premise, which is a big assumption, because actually we don't have an actor here. One of the most important actors is not here to be asked, the North Koreans. We don't know if they want transitional justice or not, But starting from this assumption, I would say that there are two dimensions or two caveats that I would flag, that I would consider important when thinking about transitional justice in post-communist Korea. First of all is a set of legacies of the communist past. We heard Professor Tatel warning about the effects of the politics of the present, the politicization and the balance of forces between the post-dictatorial pro-transitional justice and anti-transitional justice forces. This is very important. We heard here in the panel about the importance of the mode of transition and its impact on how transitional justice will be determined, will be shaped. But I also think that the legacies, the nature of the dictatorship influences the type of transitional justice you will have, and it, in a way, it's logical because, for example, you will never entertain or you will never think of property restitution in a country where the dictatorial regime didn't confiscate abusively the property, So transitional justice depends also on the nature of the dictatorial regime in place there, And in the case of North Korea, I would say that four main legacies of the communist totalitarian past are important to keep in mind when designing or thinking about possibilities of transitional justice. First of all, the fact that at the time when the communist regime will be ousted, that will be a divided society between victims, victimizers, and bystanders. And the victims will include undesirables, people in the labor camps, even former Communist Party officials who were disgraced. At one point, people who tried to cross the border illegally and couldn't, and they were imprisoned, and others. Victimizers will include the Communist Party leaders, the army, police, and secret police agents, and bystanders would be a category including most of the Communist Party membership in North Korea, which is a mass party. It's very much so a mass party that penetrated heavily the public administration and bureaucracy in these countries. So these categories of victims, victimizers, and bystanders are very large. They are much larger than in Latin American countries, for example, where you had much narrower categories of victims and victimizers. They are much larger than even in post-Nazi countries. Well, a calculated choice must be made when designing transitional justice programs in terms of choosing which categories will be served and which categories will be affected by these programs. A program that overreaches might lead to social unrest. A program that underreaches will not be able to eradicate the legacy of repression or strengthen the rule of law. I also see and think that is important an ossified, risk-averse, and clientelistic party, Communist Party, that will be disconnected from the citizenry, unwilling to accept competition, and delegitimized by its inability to foster economic redress, ensure basic necessities for the population. Well, this party will blame the leader, will say that if the leader and the leading family is getting rid of, then that's transitional justice. And I think transitional justice programs should keep in mind the fact that the victimizers category is much larger. Then there is a well-structured, militarized, and unapologetic political police, as in Eastern Europe, a political police that will continue its operations and will continue to use its agents and to target its victims as long as the secrecy of its operations will be kept. And transitional justice has to deal specifically with discontinuing the repressive character of this secret police. The many victims, and here are many victims that are present in North Korea, means that there is a public for transitional justice. There is a social category that will fight for these changes. The second dimension that I see as important in devising a transitional justice program is the fact that the takeover of the unification of North and South Korea will boil down, at least from my point of view, to a takeover by the North, by the weaker North, a takeover of the North by the South, which is much more populous, much more prosperous, and more democratic. This means that there are pluses and minuses to the transitional justice process. Yeah, the pluses are the fact that South Korea has the money, has the expertise, has the institutional capacity to effect transitional justice, but at the same time, a process that is led and funded and primarily conducted by the South can risk alienating the North Koreans and making them even averse to a reckoning with the past. This is why I think it is important for South Koreans to allow North Koreans to own the process of transitional justice. Also, the fact that South Korea will lead the transitional justice process opens it to the risk of being manipulated politically by the South Korean political forces for their own purposes. And I think when transitional justice is effected, it should aim at delivering truth and justice to North Koreans and South Koreans in that order, and allow reconciliation between the two. I'm not going to outline a program of transitional justice. There are many methods there, as we heard already. But I think some of the methods that should be considered are methods that were applied also in post-communist Eastern Europe, which are much more broader, let's say, designed for wide repression, as as one of a scholar has put it. So besides court trials, I would also think that it is good to look at reforms of the police and secret police, lustration, accusation-based lustration, access for ordinary citizens to the secret files that would effectively discontinue the secret surveillance program, rehabilitation of former political prisoners, of course, investigatory or truth commissions, because South Korea has such a great experience with them and can deliver the know-how in this area. But also, as we heard, writing history books that would also present the point of view of the victims and will be critical of communist abuses. Thank you.
I've been asked by the other members of the Asan Institute to present the recent opinion poll survey data with the questions on South Koreans' attitude toward the issue of unification and transitional justice. The data is based upon 3-day rolling average, and each survey employed a random digit dialing method for mobile and landline telephones. Now I sound like a political scientist. The sample size of each survey was 1,000 respondents over the age of 19. The margin of error is plus minus 3.1% at the 95% confidence level. So let me just move on to say something that I know. Is it working?
Yes.
All right. All right, first question is about how much are you interested in North Korean human rights? And 40.1% of respondents say that they're interested in the issue of human rights violation in Korea, North Korea. And you can see that there's a slight divergence according to the ideological dispositions. Second question regards the issue priorities. What should be addressed as the highest priority to improve North Korean human rights? And 58.8% answer that deprivation of rights for decent living, such as food shortages and starvation, famine. And we ask respondents to select 3 issues. And the second biggest issue was the forced repartition and the punishment of the defectors, with the 50.9%. And the third priority issue was deprivation of civil liberties, with 37.1%. And the political prison camps was the fourth priority designated by the South Koreans with 32%. And we also ask, in your opinion, what would be the best way to improve North Korean human rights? And the young South Koreans, I would say the post-Korean War generation was the most vocal in taking hardline approach, with 40.5% of them saying that collapse of the North Korean regime is the best way to improve North Korean human rights. South Koreans in the 30s argue the inducing change through international cooperation. And the 40s and 50s and 60s, those who have a more direct, vivid memory of the Cold War and the Korean War would say that we have to mostly rely on direct inter-Korean talks. So you can say that you may read from this result that majority of South Koreans still prefer direct inter-Korean dialogues as opposed to pressure. But if you include the opinions in favor of inducing change through international cooperation, then you can also say that about equal number of South Koreans would agree that it is now time for more hardline measures, bringing international condemnations and pressure onto North Korean regime to vividly and effectively redress the issue of human rights violation inside North Korea, rather than just relying on unproductive inter-Korean dialogues.
Where does it show what you're saying?
Pardon?
Where does it show in here?
No, it's my own interpretation of this opinion survey.
Can be quite sensitive how you ask, how you phrase your question.
Oh, we can get back to the point. All right. In your opinion, is unification of the two Koreas necessary? You can see that increasingly cautious and conditional attitude among South Koreans. So unification compared to the past in the 50s and 60s is no longer the absolute goal to be achieved at all costs. And 20.9% of South Koreans answer that we don't need to rush in order to achieve the unification. And those who answer that unification is not really necessary is almost doubled since 2012. In your opinion, what would be the best unification policy for the South Korean government? Almost half of them answer the inter-Korean talks without international intervention. And the next biggest group of answers is that unification through international cooperation. What is it? So you can sense that still there is a kind of nationalist obsession that unification is nobody else's business but among Koreans themselves. And 20% of South Koreans said that now we have to consider unification by absorption. It is interesting that the joint declaration by U.S. President Obama and President Park Geun-hye of South Korea in celebration of the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Armistice Agreement and Mutual Security Treaty defines unification based upon three principles. One is denuclearization and open market economy and liberal democracy. You can answer whether it will be acceptable for North Korean regime to accept all three principles in order to achieve the unification in negotiated and gradual terms. So what is the expected degree of reconciliation among the people of South and North after unification? There is a decent optimism among South Koreans. So 42.2% of them said, I'm sorry, there is a negative attitude. Why is it flipping over? About 20% of the South Koreans said that possesses high hope for reconciliation among the people of South and North after unification, but 35.1% of them remain cautious. If unification were to happen, do you think redress for North Korean human rights abuse is necessary? Going directly to the main topic of this conference. Those who almost 60% South Korean say that it is necessary to redress North Korean human rights abuses. And it is interesting that South Koreans with a liberal ideological bent is more vocal and supportive for redressing the human rights abuses. If redress for North Korean human rights abuse were to be made, who should play the leading role in undertaking the process? It is interesting to me that the 48.8 8% of them say that we have to accept and apply international standard measures and activities by the international actors, which is quite different from the previous survey, indicating that still a majority of South Koreans believe that path toward the unification should be primarily determined by Koreans themselves. So there's a slight difference between the way that Koreans think of the best way of achieving unification and the best way of achieving redressing the transitional justice in case of unification of Korea. Right? Who should be punished for human rights abuses in North Korea? Everyone involved punish only high-ranking officials, do not refuse and pardon perpetrated after truth-finding process. It is very hard to read this in a graph. But you can see that what Lavinia called the two F's, forgetting and forgiving, has a very low degree of support among Koreans, only at 18.8%. And the majority of Koreans would say that two P's, punishment and prosecution. Is it necessary that the United Korean government provide aid to the victims of human rights abuses under the North Korean regime? 60% say necessary. It depends on how you read it, whether it could be regarded as a substantially high degree of support, making sacrifice to precipitate and facilitate integration with people in the North. But I'd like to add that in my own research on how much personal sacrifice that average South Korean is willing to make in order to aid North Korean defectors, South Koreans in their 20s is as unwilling as South Koreans in their 60s in terms of making personal sacrifice to aid North Korean defectors. If government compensation were to be made, what type of compensation would be appropriate? 67, over 2/3 of South Koreans nominate aid, rehabilitation, and resettlement. Okay, if you think government compensation is not necessary, what is the reason? They are worried about the financial burden on the unified Korean government, and the responsibility is on the former North Korean government. If unification were to happen, what do you think about holding North Korea responsible for the following acts? Here is the reason why I think that bringing in security dimensions into our consideration of the unification and redressing transitional justice is important, because South Koreans are still holding on to the demand for North Korean coming clean about the act of aggressions in the past. So let me conclude by saying that the attitude of the South Korean toward the issue of unification and the transitional justice has been evolving in a very interesting way. I don't dare to give you any finite conclusion to give you the definite picture of it. But one thing I would like to add in my conclusion to give you an idea is that the degree that South Koreans define the issue of unification in terms of ethnic nationalism has been diminishing. We have an expert on East Asian nationalism here, so I'll be careful. But I conducted the opinion survey recently with a question that, hypothetical soccer matches between different national teams, like U.S. soccer teams and Korean soccer team, which team are you rooting for? And Professor Youngshik at Stanford University used the exactly same questionnaires to gauge, South Koreans' favorability ratings toward other countries. Interesting finding is that In the survey conducted in 1990s, in hypothetical case of soccer match between U.S. and North Korea, only 15.5% of South Koreans would be rooting for the victory of the U.S. soccer team, and 83.2% would be rooting for North Korean team. But in response to exactly the same question in April this year, it's that even. 47.8% of South Koreans answered that they would be rooting for the U.S. soccer team, and 47.7% said that they would be rooting for North Korean team. So something is changing. Thank you. Now I think all four speakers have put enough food for thoughts on the table. So now we are open to question and answer. Chris, you have the first question.
Thanks very much. A really fascinating discussion. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. I beg to indulge for two questions, because they've been, in a sense, very diverse panels. Drawing from the Cohen Stan presentations with the admonition to look for similar, possibly similar examples to draw the kinds of lessons you want to draw, and Professor Cohen's really good discussion of all the bazillion questions you have to answer. It would be good to look at what lessons have been learned in South Korea from the post-war transition from the Japanese occupation, because it seemed to me that every single question that was raised about retaliation and collaboration, very difficult, very emotional things, surely there's a lot of data to draw on. So I'd be interested in comment on that. And from Professor Natsios, that was the most realistic, hardest-nosed, most succinct summation I've ever heard of how we're living in a damn dream world if we think the Chinese are going to let it happen. I don't know if I should speak for Gil or not, but we were sitting here saying, yeah, the whole time you were talking. And with these polls in mind, it raised this other question. If it looks like there is a transition taking place, whether it's a collapse or whatever, and that the Chinese are, for their own well-known reasons, are taking it over to control it, do we have what kind of reaction do we get in South Korea? Do we get a nationalist reaction? Is South Korea prepared to fight, to liberate the Northern Brothers? What are we looking at here? Because that would be one hell of a strategic conundrum that would also involve the United States. So we hope the more practical thing we have to face is, how do we deal with the justice? But we may have to face a really tough one, and that is the Chinese try to take the place over in order to control it. Thanks.
I'd like to abuse my power with the risk that I will be subject to transitional justice later on. But I have a similar question about China's choices in the future, in case there will be a prospective of unification.
Yes.
China being seen meddling with the process of unification, taking the choices and willpower away from Koreans themselves. Would it be too, strategically speaking, dangerous for the Chinese? Because China has the aspiration to achieve a unification with Taiwan. So it might be setting a very dangerous precedent that would hurt China's effort to unify Taiwan in the future. That's my question.
Well, one, I don't think the Chinese are going to do this in any blatant way. The Chinese are a remarkably subtle society. I was at a simulation. I won't even tell you the details of it, but there was a Chinese general there, retired Chinese general, and I said, we don't trust you, in this simulation, to deliver a hard message to the North Koreans. And he said, well, we've delivered many hard messages to the North Koreans. We said we were disappointed in their behavior publicly. And that is the most extreme statement. That is almost a declaration of war against North Korea. And I said, that's not by Western standards. I mean, even South Korean standards. That is, but he said that's by our standards. So our standards, even linguistically, are different than theirs. They've already taken over the economy in the next 3 years. Did anyone know that? Has anybody commented on that? I mean, a few scholars have, and there are think tanks in South Korea. but they've already taken over the economy. There are profound changes going on, and a lot of this has to do with, I think, a strategic decision. It didn't happen by chance. They made a decision. Now, I think there is now this is anecdotal evidence from people who talk to mid-level and senior mid-level ranking North Koreans, which is the greatest fear in South Korea and North Korea, other than the Kim dynasty and the Politburo. I don't mean the very upper reaches of the elite in the North. I mean below that, the mid-level people and the upper mid-level people, and certainly the poor. And they, with the South Koreans, do not want the Chinese taking over the country. There is a huge fear in South Korea of the Chinese hegemon. And that is why, in my view, you're seeing this shift in opinion. And so my view is this. If we start talking about transitional justice reaching deep down into North Korean society, what do you think they're going to make? They're going to change that calculation. They're going to say, you know, we're afraid of the Chinese, but now if they're going to put us all in jail if the South Koreans take over, maybe we'll side with the with Kim Jong-un and with the Politburo that we want the Chinese in here. We don't all go to jail. I think people start personalizing this when it comes down to whether or not they themselves are going to face trials. So one thing I would say, and I don't like to be too cavalier about this, is I would not want to reach too far down, because you want to divide the great bulk of North Korean society, including the Communist Party, including the military, maybe below the rank of general, maybe below the senior leadership of the party, from the party elite themselves. Kim Jong-il told Hwang Jong-yup, he's dead now, so I can say this. It was delivered to me, and I did an interview of his former chief of staff, and he said to me, Kim Jong-il called everyone together during the middle of the famine. He said the country is collapsing. We are at risk. If the regime falls and the South Koreans and the Americans don't hang us, our own people will hang us. And he said, have a strong heart. And what he meant by that, a strong will to avoid a collapse of the regime, because we're all going to be put on trial and hung. That's what he said. I think the fear of the very upper reaches of the elite is that they're going to be executed. And they'll do anything to stop it, including allying themselves with the Chinese. So one thing we don't want to do is act as though we're going to put everybody in North Korea on trial. It's not our decision anyway. It's the South Koreans have to decide this. But I think it's very unwise to unite half the country with a covert Chinese takeover so that people can protect themselves. What you want to do is take the 2% at the top and divide them from the rest of North Korean society by saying, if anyone's put on trial, it's going to be the very top people, and that's it.
Well, okay. But two Chinese want to take over North Korea.
No, I don't think they want to take over. It's a big mess. I mean, it'll be a big. They're going to do it very subtly. We don't even know it's going. It's already being taken over in terms of the economy. I think they would do it through other North Koreans. They will do it through a change of leadership, through the military, for example. The Chinese military and the North Korean military are very close. I've been in China and I've listened to the Chinese generals talk as though the North Korean generals are even Chinese sometimes. You listen to them and you're wondering who's on which side. I think that they'll do it in a subtle way that will not be overt. They're not going to have 100,000 Chinese troops on the 38th parallel. But there are other ways that it could happen that we won't even see it until it's all over.
Okay. In the middle, and why don't we collect the two questions at a time in the interest of time?
Mike Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. What's the, is there any open source documentation on the takeover, this economic takeover you've talked about so far, where one could find that? And secondly, we have an informal summit coming up between the President of the United States and the President of China in a couple of weeks. Do you know from your own experience, has the top leaders, and this is an informal one, so they can talk beyond sort of the normal talking points, whether the top leadership of the United States has ever talked with the top leadership of China about scenarios and what the United States would do and wouldn't do in case of a North Korean collapse, Because from what you said and what so many other people have said, clearly the Chinese are guided by Gorbachev in every respect. And that they think Gorbachev sold the ranch, and that's East Germany ended up in NATO, et cetera, et cetera. And whether there's been any effort by the United States to tell the Chinese that the same parallel wouldn't happen in this instance.
Okay, thank you. We will invite one more question from the back. Lisa? Okay, yeah. He's up front here. There's a microphone.
The only problem, Dr. Natsios, with your
I'm
view
not a doctor, so.
is that you would have to declare now out loud that there will be no hanging.
I know, I don't know how you do
Otherwise, they're going
that.
to assume that.
Well,
There are two declarations that you could make, which would make it less likely for China to intervene or to even to try to Finlandize a successor regime. And that is to promise that there will not be a large American presence
Yes.
north of the 38th parallel, and that a unified Korea will not have nuclear weapons. Now everyone says NPT covers that, but it's really not enough. You need a declaration with details about how the bombs are going to be extracted, just as you did in Kazakhstan, and then let the Chinese know that that is there. With those two things, this promise of American expansion will be limited, and the promise of denuclearization of the unified republic. Chinese will be less likely to A, invade, or B, to Vichy state the place. I know this because I chatted with some mid-ranking Chinese diplomats at the National Defense University.
I think there are lots of things going on that we're not hearing. And I can tell you, having been in office and having talked to people now that I'm out of office with other people, there are lots of things going on that our diplomats and military officers are doing with the Chinese. I'm not going to describe them because some of them will get me into legal trouble. But there are conversations going on, and there are messages that have been delivered, but I don't want to go any further than that. The Chinese don't want a conflict with us or with South Korea. We are huge trading partners. If there is a disruption of the markets in the United States and in China, it will damage both of our economies in a huge way. And I might add, the South Koreans are one of the largest trading partners with China as well. So I am not suggesting the Chinese are looking for a conflict, but they don't want chaos on their border, and they don't want American troops and they don't want nuclear weapons in North Korea. They're absolutely opposed to them. Anything that the Chinese want stability on their borders, they do not want threats, and they do not want anything that's going to destabilize the balance of power. And I understand that. It doesn't. You don't require an advanced degree in Chinese politics to understand that. I mean, most of us who've dealt with them understand that. I mean, when we share interests, there is some interests we do share. We don't want a nuclear exchange. I mean, these threats upset the Chinese as much as they upset us. The fact that there's a debate going on in China is astonishing. The deputy editor of the party newspaper at the Harvard, I shouldn't use the word Harvard, the elite university, the party school in Beijing, wrote an op-ed piece on the front page of the party newspaper in which he said, cut them loose. They're endangering our relationship with South Korea and the United States. It's not worth it. It's a failed state. Why do we even care what happens to them? Now, he has since been removed, but clearly someone in the leadership told me could publish that story in the first place. And Chinese intellectuals privately and military will tell you there's a lot of sympathy for his point of view with the leadership. Now, the other thing is, there's a new leader now. And President who's not in power anymore. Even though we say it's the same government, things change when there's a new leader. And so I think the new leader is a little worried about the more extreme nationalist elements of the Chinese military. He's trying to satisfy them. There's this whole neo-communist movement within the country that they repressed during the transition, but there was a little revolt there for a while, if you remember. And so there is a slight degree of instability in China itself. I don't mean on the streets, but in the party elite in terms of this transition. So we have to think through exactly where the Chinese on their own transition is.
Thank you.
Stanley Koger. In his second inaugural address, President Lincoln said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds." That's a different approach to reconciliation. Was Lincoln wrong?
The question is directly to whom?
I would say primarily Professor Cohen.
Okay.
Contrasting, for example, Hirohito with Robert E. Lee.
That's quite a contrast. Yeah.
In terms of not prosecuting and using.
I'm not sure exactly what your question is. I mean, are you suggesting that that's the way that all transitions should be managed, or is that what you're asking me?
It seems to me there are three approaches. One is war crimes. We've had Nuremberg. The other is Truth and Reconciliation, South Africa, in between. And the third is Lincoln. There was only one, I think, prosecution for war crimes after the Civil War. Andersonville, the commandant, was hanged. But the trial of Jefferson Davis collapsed. Robert E. Lee was not prosecuted. So you have these three approaches. How do you know which approach to use in any particular case?
Well, I think that's what I was trying to talk about, is that you don't, in the abstract, that in each particular case, you have to assess what your goals are. What are your political goals? How can you achieve them? How does transitional justice fit or not fit into those political goals? And the way that you evaluate all of that will be determined by the situation in which you find yourself, and that situation will be constantly changing. I mean, if you look at sort of the post-World War II example, not just Hirohito, but I mean Japan and Germany writ large, in the heat of victory and desire for accountability and revenge, because there was certainly a desire for revenge along with accountability, there were incredibly sort of far-reaching ideas about how widespread the justice process should be. Plans that potentially could have embraced millions of individuals, because let's remember that at Nuremberg, 6 organizations were prosecuted as criminal organizations. 3 of them were convicted as criminal organizations on the basis that it would provide the ability to prosecute any member of those 3 organizations simply for being a member. Fortunately, that was somewhat limited by the Nuremberg judgment, which said that they would have to know the criminal purpose of the organization of which they were a member. And in fact, many people were convicted of being members of criminal organizations. So there was an idea, let's just punish everybody, I mean, more or less. All of that changed as the Cold War developed. And by 1947, 1948, the political problem was, how can we get these war criminals out of jail as soon as possible, because the Germans really want us to, if we want to get them on board as our strategic ally against the Soviet Union. So, I mean, we just have to understand these are not abstract decisions about justice. The decisions about justice are taking place in a very complex political context, and it's politics that's driving it. It's not justice that's driving it. Justice is a factor in the political calculation of those who are evaluating the situation and making these decisions.
All right. Troy?
Hi, Troy Saran with the Korea Economic Institute and for CFR Asan. I'd just like to sort of build on, because Chris kind of started this with his question about the transition in South Korea after the occupation by Japan, and what Stanley said. I agree that transitions don't take place in a vacuum and that they're all unique. But I feel as though when we talk about this, our memory or our study seems to go back to about World War II, and that's about as far as we go. But I guess to sort of play off the whole phrase about what was the impact of the French Revolution, that it's too soon to tell, the advantage of those is that there's still people alive from the Soviet Union, everything that we can talk to and ask them, what did you feel went right, what did you feel went wrong? But I don't know that we've necessarily seen how those will play out completely, and societies tend to shift and go through phases. And the reason I say that is a colleague of mine once suggested, okay, well, we should look at the U.S. Civil War and see how that played out. Being at the Italian, one thing that strikes me is that, you know, last year was the 150th anniversary of Italian unification, but most people didn't want to celebrate it because the North and the South don't like each other, and there's a lot of talk about separation. So the question, I guess, is to broaden this just beyond even the justice factor, but just successful transition. Do we really study long-term transitions and kind of see how those play out and what has really worked and what hasn't? Because, you know, if you look at a lot of the Eastern European countries, there's a sort of slide back towards authoritarianism in a lot of cases as well. So, I mean, have we really looked at kind of like the long-term trend and see what really works once we could say the generations that went through it are gone and everything? Thank you.
Professor Stan, I think you can take this question.
You know, I think you raised some really good point, but again, it's a matter of which countries you are looking for. I wouldn't say that Eastern Europe is sliding back. I would vehemently contest this statement. Yes, there are problems in Hungary. Yes, there are problems in Romania and Bulgaria with the way the democratic institutions are working. There is lots of corruption, and this is not quite the democracy we envisioned in 1989 when we went in the streets. But at the same time, I would say that we should, actually, you make a very good point. We should look at transition long term, and maybe 25 years is not enough to really understand what's going on.
Let me just add one thing that I wanted to say it in my statement. In all of the, not all, not Poland, but many, maybe not in the Baltic states, maybe not in the Czechoslovakia, most of the former Soviet state transitions involve the secret police, not universally, evolving into criminal mafias who control the economy and try to control the political system. And that is not something that's been well studied. There's several books out on it. The reason that Russia does not have the rule of law is because the KGB still exists. They changed the name, and they're in business now. And they're in racketeering businesses. They threaten legitimate businesses, new businesses, for protection money. I think one of the problems is if we want to prosecute everybody, we will drive the people from the former regime underground, and they will simply run things illicitly. If you don't prosecute anybody, and there's no consequences for their behavior when they were in power, then you will have what happened in Russia, which is a criminal mafia running the country from behind the scenes. And I think there's a risk if no one's prosecuted in North Korea, and on the other hand, if everyone's prosecuted. If you go too far, you will drive everyone underground. If there's impunity, then people will say, well, we'll do whatever we want to. We're not going to be prosecuted. I mean, after the transition finishes. I think the big problem for Korea is if South Korea does somehow have the transition, they need to understand everybody has to go somewhere. Either they go to jail or they find some legitimate way of supporting themselves. The people who are running the the secret police in North Korea, they're not stupid. They're there because they're very shrewd. Some of them are good, criminal managers. They've committed horrendous atrocities, but they know how to use power. They know how to run a large organization. Those skills can be very useful. Who do you think's running the markets in North Korea right now? The wives of members of the secret police and the officer corps of the military. There are some reports, some substantial reports, that is who's running the markets.
Professor Rosman.
Gil Rosman, Princeton. I want to focus again on South Korea and go back to some of the overall impression from the polls and from the debate in the Nomuhun administration about collaborators and what is the just approach to the tradition, because after all, the North Koreans have long claimed that they have a stronger claim to nationalism because of the way they've dealt with the Japanese legacy. Does that matter in this transition, the fact that South Koreans don't agree on what should be done about their history and about Japan, and who justly is entitled to the cloak of nationalism in their country, and is there any way that North Koreans, perhaps with some Chinese support, can reclaim some of that as they try to press for a different approach to the transition?
Yeah, I think there's a real and significant sensitivity, if not concern, among South Koreans that redressing transitional justice in case of unification can be compromised and truncated by the logic of international security, as it happened to Japan and Korea at the end of the Second World War. The reason why Korea was divided, a country that did not wage a Pacific War, was a reflection of the emerging order of the Cold War rivalry. And Koreans still question why it was not Japan but Korea that had to be divided. Why Emperor Hirohito was not put on Tokyo trial in the name of Cold War security calculation. So I think there is a real concern among South Koreans that there might be an attempt between North Korean regime and international actors, United States, China, you name it, to make a kind of trade-off that South Koreans do not want to see. Basically, North Korean regimes giving up nuclear weapons programs, missile technology, in exchange for amnesty and protection. That would be a very difficult for South Koreans to accept. After all, as you pointed out, the haunted memory of former collaborators of the Japanese colonial government, not properly subjected to transitional justice, lasted even today. South Koreans do not want to go there again in case of North Korea, political merger with North Korea. We can offer one more question. Yes.
Just a quick question. Basically, two questions. One is
Yeah, here's my.
Dr. Bong, because you have this poll reflecting the younger generations are less inclined to sacrifice whatever financial and political means for the reunifications. But my sense is that because it's also what has happened the last several years, run by the conservative government, because the dialogue, it's how the younger generation, the economy has been very down, so they tend to have less optimistic about the, concerns also about the unification, because they have to deal with their unemployment. So it is I'm just touching the base to see whether that has have influence on the response to your questionnaires. And then my quick question is about the Mr. Natsios. Am I pronouncing right?
Yes, you are.
What I'm hearing from you is that basically North Korea in practice run by Chinese economically. At least,
yes.
right? But what does that mean? It seems like the U.S., at least so far, the foreign policy regarding the Korean Peninsula has been just a status quo. Keep the as it is, just no provocation, just we deal with it economically with the Chinese trade, extending trade, at least, So what is your thinking? At least now you left the government, you're outside, maybe you have less, insights. But what does that mean to, we are talking about transitional justice, but my feeling is that it might be premature. We don't have even sense of where we are heading. You might know better. Thank you.
Would you like to take up the question?
Well, I'm telling you I didn't assemble the data. Economists have in South Korea and in the United States who are scholars of North and South Korea. Marcus Nolan, Nick Eberstadt, Steve Haggard have been studying this. I'm relying on their data. They're economists, I'm not. And Andrei Lonkov, who teaches in South Korea, who's a Russian scholar, but he went to school in Pyongyang as a student. And they're talking about the massive transition of the North Korean economy right now. 70% of the exports of North Korea go to China. So they're heavily dependent on their income. There's been a massive increase in trade in the last 3 years between South Korea and in the billions of dollars. There was no trade. There was trade before. It was informal trade. They're cutting down all the forests and sending the lumber to China in exchange for food. They're now sending huge amounts of coal to, but the stuff they're sending, the material from North Korea they're sending to China is not renewable, which is to say it's not manufactured goods like the South Koreans sending cars for us to buy here in the United States. That's renewable. I mean, you manufacture them, you send them here, we buy them, and we have an exchange. That's not the case. It is a very one-sided thing, which is the Chinese get it, and eventually the North Koreans are going to run out of whatever they're exporting. I don't recall a percentage, but it's a huge percentage of North Korean electrical power is from China. China exports their electrical power into North Korea. If they shut down those lines, the collapsed economy would be completely moribund. A huge percentage of their food supply is from China. So food, electricity, and trade are all dominated by the Chinese. And if you go into the all of these informal markets that are operating all over North Korea, almost all of it are Chinese goods. That's how I mean they've taken over. Have they sent people in the ministries to give instruction? No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that they are basically a appendage of the Chinese economy, and so the Chinese have veto power, which I don't know why people haven't connected. In the North Korean and Chinese mind, politics and economics are connected to each other. We tend to separate them in the West because we have a private market economy, and they do in South Korea as well. But that's not the case in North Korea and China. They marry the two.
If I could just,
Please.
I'd just like to add one quick word. This is not a unique configuration of Chinese foreign policy, and there are similar processes happening in Laos, in Cambodia. 25% of the arable land in the country of Cambodia is under long-term, like 100-year lease to Chinese companies.
Okay, note to self, we got to invite Chinese panelists next time, right? Very quickly, in response to your question, according to another public opinion survey we conducted, 68.5% of South Koreans believe that economic aid to North Korea should be subject to change of behavior of the North, so no more open-ended engagement toward North Korea. But young South Koreans make distinction between North Korean regime responsible for all these heinous crimes and atrocities and North Korean people deserving the genuine caring and support from the outside world.
At least they discuss this.
Right. That concludes the first session. Please join me in thanking the speakers.